2003 was a landmark year in gaming, during which people were able to get their hands on legendary games such as Knights of the Old Republic, Grand Theft Auto Vice City, and Drake of the 99 Dragons. Also in 2003, Legacy of Kain, Defiance was released, becoming what at the time of writing this video is the final properly released game in the franchise. Unless you count the competitive multiplayer game Nosgoth, which was cancelled while it was still in early access. After the very short company introduction video, you're immediately in the main menu. Unlike in Blood Omen 2, Defiance does not have a story introduction video at the launch of the game, which I find to be a good thing. The menu itself is more reminiscent of the Soul Reaver 2 menu than the Blood Omen 2 menu, as the moving background and the dreamlike effect overlay on top of it make a return. The options of the game are very similar to the previous games. There are basic video configuration settings and audio settings, which still don't allow you to modify different channels to configure the audio to your liking, but instead has on and off switches for sound effects and music. Control configurations as well are basically the same as they've been before. You choose your desired controller and can then configure what each specific button does. The GOG version I'm playing had some issues with an X-input controller, so instead I dusted off my old direct input controller, which worked perfectly without needing to change any configuration settings. There's also one very welcome addition within the settings menus, as finally the series has subtitles, and you can choose between several languages or just turn them off completely. Personally, I prefer to have subtitles always on whenever possible, since sound mixing and effects on voice lines can make the dialogue difficult to understand, especially since English is not my first language. As you begin the game, you're presented with an introductory cinematic narrated by Kane, establishing the theme of fighting against destiny itself, trying to come up with a way to find a better option than those that fate has put in front of you, as clips of the cinematics of Soul Reaver play in the background. Eventually, the cutscene moves into newly created content, with the latter portion of the cinematic taking the form of a pre-rendered video created with in-engine assets. In this portion, some aspects of the game are, I wouldn't say made clear, but easy enough to understand for people already familiar with the story of the franchise. Kane, now armed with the Soul Reaver, is returning to the Sarafan stronghold at some point in time after the events of Soul Reaver 2 to look for the time streamer Moebius to gain answers for some so far unrevealed questions. Since the Sarafan Order is still very much alive and well, and serving Moebius himself, for returning players this establishes the timeline to be similar to that where the final moments of Soul Reaver 2 took place. After one of the shortest introduction segments of the entire franchise, you enter the game and gain control of Kane. Within the Sarafan Fortress begins the tutorial, and compared to the previous games, several aspects have changed rather immensely. The user interface is once more very simplistic, and the entirety of it is located at the bottom left of the screen. In this UI element, there's a large red orb with a vial extruding from it, implying this is a health bar. There's also another vertical bar which looks somewhat vaguely runic, and at the bottom is a horizontal display of the Soul Reaver blade. The first difference compared to the old games you may notice when you begin to move. Moving itself works as you'd expect. You press the analog stick in a direction, and this makes Kane move in that direction. Simple and functional. How this reveals some changes, however, is that now the camera doesn't follow the player in the same way it did before, but Defiance now relies on a more stationary camera system, similar to how games like Devil May Cry function. You can turn around the camera in this mode, but for the most part, this seems rather unnecessary. The first part of the tutorial introduces you to basic fighting mechanics. You can enter the combat mode by pressing the action button or by pressing the auto face button. In the combat mode, you'll automatically face an enemy to attack them and can control which enemy to attack with the left analog stick. This is much more functional than the rather janky system of the earlier games. The heavy attack has been replaced with a lift attack, which attempts to strike the enemy into the air. If you manage to do this, it is possible to jump and use the action button to strike the enemy several times without them being able to defend themselves. You can also use the jump button to dodge, during which Kane uses his mist form to evade an incoming attack. This is a rather simple system, but it's functional and feels rather satisfying, as it's far less clunky than, say, the combat system in Soul Reaver. Once you've dealt enough damage to an enemy, you can notice a returning feature which was absent in Blood Omen 2. Since you are now playing as Kane, his vampiric weaknesses and needs are once more a concern, and this includes feeding. This time, however, instead of feeding from corpses, you can once more only feed from enemies that have entered the stun state. The stun state is signified by a noticeable flash that appears when the enemy's health has been depleted. In this state, if you wait too long, the enemy dies and their body disappears, requiring the player to be rather swift with their feeding. The feeding itself has two different styles now. There's of course the ranged feeding, which has been a trope of the franchise since the very first game, but this time you can also feed from enemies in a more traditional vampire way, if you're close enough, as you press the feed button. Unlike Blood Omen 2, however, blood does not add to an experience bar, which increases the size of your health pool and merely acts as a way of healing yourself. After defeating the Sarafan guards, the tutorial moves on to the next phase and introduces you to basic platforming via the means of jumping. Just like in Blood Omen 2, jumping is rather simplistic. There's one button to jump, and that's it. You can still hold the jump button to float for a moment, but other than that, the more special jumping features from games like the Soul Reaver aren't here. After jumping and climbing over several obstacles, the game demonstrates several features of the game in rather quick succession. The first being the return of climbable walls, which for returning players should be familiar from the Soul Reaver games. In Defiance, Kane also has the ability to scale these walls. Immediately at the top of the first climbable wall is a large window with bars, and by walking against it, Kane automatically turns himself into the mist form and walks through it, revealing what kinds of environmental features to keep an eye out for as you traverse the world of Nosgoth. On the other side of that window is the Sarafan prison, where a cutscene implores you to feed on the prisoner shackled in this rather unpleasant-looking dungeon. A very good way to demonstrate the feeding feature for those who may have missed the feeding windows during the initial combat tutorial. If you explore the jail cells of the dungeon, you will also find your first collectible item within a breakable relic. These are, once more, very reminiscent of Soul Reaver, as the item you find is a shard of a health glyph, and collecting a full glyph will add to your maximum health. Deeper within the dungeon, the game demonstrates to you the existence of breakable walls by blocking your progress with one. As you strike down the wall, another cutscene displays a feature which the player can use during gameplay as well. Kane has the power of telekinesis, which can be used to throw enemies around. In this cutscene, the ability is used rather lethally, as the spiked features on the walls aren't merely set decoration, but can be used to impale enemies. Yet another returning feature from Soul Reaver. Kane also explains to those not already familiar with the Legacy of Kain vampire lore that vampires are weak to water, and it should be avoided at all costs, imploring the player to find a way around this stream of liquid death. At the top of the room, if you have even a modicum of interest in exploring more than the absolutely obvious, you can find another of the relics which contains a collectible. This time it's a telekinesis rune, however, showing the player that the vertical bar in your user interface is a representation of your magical power, which makes sense considering it looks very similar to the magic power indicator in the first Blood Omen game. Further ahead, the game introduces you to magical barriers which block your progress, and how the symbols in these magical barriers represent the means with which you're intended to dispel the barrier. The first one you encounter causes the Soul Reaver to resonate, implying a link between them. But attempting to strike the barrier does nothing, causing Kane to come to the conclusion that the Reaver is not yet powerful enough to destroy this barrier. The next area finally acts as a tutorial to the telekinesis feature, which has been hinted at a few times now, as you're locked within a courtyard with enemies shooting at you from the ramparts. Telekinesis is an interesting feature and can be used to add some interesting variety to the combat. In this area specifically, you can tap the telekinesis button, which acts as a ranged push of sorts, allowing you to throw the guards of ramparts to their death. You can also hold the button and lift enemies. While they're lifted, you can move in a direction and release the telekinesis button to throw the enemy in that direction, allowing you to do things like draw the enemies closer to you, or in places where it's possible, throw them at environmental hazards to kill them. This, however, does prevent you from feeding on your foes, so using this ability has its pros and cons. Yes, you can kill an enemy very easily, but you have to surrender your opportunity to feed. This is a very fun feature and a really nice addition that works much better than the somewhat janky carry and throw system of the Soul Reaver. The only strange part to me is how the feature was teased several times before actually teaching you about the system. Considering how the tutorials of the game work, to me it would have made more sense to actually teach the player how the feature functions before displaying more creative uses of the ability. Even further within the bowels of the Sarafan Fortress, you find even more magical barriers blocking your way, this time with different symbols on them. A sword and a shield. In the same area, there's also a statue of a knight with glowing bits in its hands, being a somewhat obvious clue to what you're intended to do to proceed. As you explore the fortress, you'll also encounter projectile traps, which were extremely prominent in Blood Omen, but haven't made too many appearances since. Unlike Blood Omen, however, these projectile traps can be destroyed, making the area more safe for traversal. Soon after this, you'll also encounter your first checkpoint, which the game pauses with a pop-up to explain you. In previous videos, I've praised whenever a game lets you organically learn things, and even when they teach you more directly. I prefer when the game doesn't just pause to directly tell you every detail of a thing, but actually respects your ability to learn things. Defiance somewhat falters on this point, by pausing the game very often with a pop-up to teach you about a specific feature of the game. It's not something I'm vehemently against, but I am a little bit disappointed that a series that was good at teaching the player in a way that doesn't feel like someone backseating you and pressing pause to explain something now does exactly that. The checkpoint system itself is a very important part of the save system, which works similarly to that of Blood Omen 2. You can once more save whenever you want, but you continue from the position of the last checkpoint. It's not exactly that simple, however, since if you save between checkpoints, the game does seem to save things you've done and found, but still returns you to the last checkpoint you found before saving. The save descriptions themselves are also decent enough, telling you which chapter you're on and the amount of playtime in that playthrough. This makes it easy enough to keep track of which save you wish to load whenever you return to the game. It's not the worst system and is very much passable. Eventually, you find yourself in a grand hall of the Sarafan Fortress, very similar to the one seen in Soul Reaver 2, with some exceptions. Here we don't have a grandiose stained glass window portraying the fall of William the Just and the victory of the Sarafan Order over the ancient vampires. Instead, where you might expect to see the tomb of William is a pedestal holding some kind of an emblem. Kane explains that this emblem is clearly of vampire origin, intended to empower the Soul Reaver, and knowing the machinations of Moebius, believes this is not a coincidence, but a deliberate event orchestrated by the time streamer. But for what purpose? As you take this emblem, the Soul Reaver pulses with magical energy, and you're surrounded by Sarafan guards, imploring you to surrender, promising a swift, painless death if you do so. This gives the game a perfect opportunity to remind us of the fantastic personality of our sexy goth bad boy vampire.
I could promise you the same, but it would be a lie.
However, instead of the game immediately allowing you to begin fighting these humans, the game once more pauses to display you a tutorial pop-up. This time something that seems to have little to nothing to do with your current situation. Defiance has a rather comprehensive status menu, a feature which wasn't really a thing before, a detail that I have mentioned was not a good thing. Such as in Blood Omen, not having a proper status window to display which blood fountains you'd found, and so on, was an oversight that, while not a humongous problem, could make it harder for people to keep track of what they had done, especially if taking a short break from playing the game. This time, that's not an issue, and the status menu is split into 3 pages. Currently, however, the menu is rather lacking in information, but gives promise of much more stuff being in the game. The central page, on which the menu initially opens on, has your primary objective at the very top, and the current minor objective right below it. On the left are 3 artifact slots which have yet to be introduced. On the right is a combat experience bar in the shape of a Soul Reaver, implying there's some sort of a leveling system in the game. At the bottom is a Reaver's menu with 1 emblem on it. This was the artifact that you just recovered, and hovering on top of the emblem displays a 3D model of the Soul Reaver in the center window and calls this the Balance Emblem. What does it mean, other than that it's named after one of the aspects of the Pillars of Nosgoth, which at this point in time remain completely unexplained to players who might have chosen this game as their first Legacy of Kain game? We don't really know. Using our knowledge of the previous games, we can assume these are similar in function to the elemental reavers of Soul Reaver 2 and have specific features that can be used to open new pathways. The left side page displays the collectible items you've found. These are the health talismans, which can be split into thirds, and there are 4 slots where they seem to fit. There are also the telekinetic runes and arcane tomes. Arcane tomes are collectible items which don't really do anything for the gameplay, but instead unlock extra material for the main menu, including things like concept art. The design of this page can be seen either in a positive or negative light, depending on your point of view about video game design. Personally, I kind of appreciate the design, since the layout of the collectible menu gives the player a very good idea of how many things the game has, making it easy to know whether you've already found all the things or if you should still keep looking. I can also understand why someone would not like this, since in effect, telling the player how many hidden items the game has could be seen as a spoiler which diminishes some of the parts from the enjoyment of discovery. The page on the right side, however, is currently completely empty, implying that these things will be explained later. After familiarizing yourself with the status menu, you remember that this tutorial portion was introduced in the middle of a fight and swiftly dispatched the puny little humans attempting to thwart your progress, before being shown that now, finally, you can destroy at least some of the magical barriers blocking your progress. The tutorial continues introducing new features little by little, showing you an indentation on a door, which Kane explains is a curious lock, telling the player that there must be some kind of an object to be placed into this lock, which will allow you to open it. Soon you're also introduced to the aim feature of the telekinesis ability, and demonstrates how you can sometimes break objects with this ability, allowing you to open new pathways for traversal. Then comes one of the most confounding parts of the entire tutorial segment, another combat tutorial. In this room, you're tasked with practicing your combat against training dummies, as the game directly explains to you all of the basic combat moves you can perform, and expects you to perform these before continuing the tutorial process. In theory, this is skippable, but in practice, it kind of isn't, since completing the entire tutorial rewards you with a shard of a health emblem. To me, this is absolutely strange game design. I was already confused with the placement of the telekinesis tutorial, but this one is even more weird to me. After having to fight a lot of enemies to even get to this point, you're only now shown all of the features of the combat system, many of which you've likely figured out yourself just by trying different button combinations during the multiple fights the game has already put in your way. Why is this here and not at the beginning of the game? Not only that, it's another example of being more direct about tutorials instead of allowing the player to learn things on their own, which to me is somewhat intrusive game design. It's not a deal breaker to me, but it's also a design choice that I'm not entirely pleased with. Especially the illusion of choice by locking a limited power-up item behind the complete tutorial segment, to me, is just bad. Soon, it's very likely that the game once more pauses with another tutorial pop-up as you're fighting, telling you that you've unlocked something called Cadaverous Laceration, imploring you to check the status menu for an explanation. This is also the point when I went into the game options menu and decided to finally turn the hints off, since unlike Soul Reaver 2 for example, which had a relatively non-intrusive way of displaying hints, the constant pausing of the game for tutorial pop-ups was beginning to become annoying to me. The problem with this solution became exceedingly clear when I restarted the game from the beginning to test it, as while the game indeed stops most of the tutorial pop-ups from appearing, it doesn't prevent all of them from happening, and the game is still paused with several pop-ups even when the hint system is turned off. What turning off hints does is turn off the non-intrusive button prompt sometimes shown on screen without pausing your game. So in effect, turning off the hint system doesn't prevent the game from pausing for pop-ups, but does stop the game from giving the player important information about the game's controls. In other words, I turned it back on again, which showed me another curious aspect of the hint system. Despite having played large portions of the tutorial already, after turning the hints back on, the game paused several times in rather quick succession, as every pop-up that the game had not shown were now shown whenever applicable, and considering the game had opened up a little bit more, those moments came rather quickly. Entering the status menu again, the purpose of the right side page is finally made clear, as you've unlocked a new combat move, the usage of which is explained in this page. In addition to having leveled up and gained a new combat move, the game also tells you that you can use the lift attack on stunned enemies to feed the reaver. What this means in practice is that while fighting enemies slowly fills the soul reaver-shaped bar in your user interface, using this finishing move on an enemy increases that bar even more. Once the bar is full, you can hold and release the attack button to release a wave of magic from the Soul Reaver, which is often an area of effect spell that damages all enemies around you. These I do find quite fantastic. One of the major gripes I've had with most of the games in the series is how fighting quickly became boring, since the mechanics for fighting enemies remained basically the same from the beginning of the game. Adding a feature like leveling up your combat abilities and learning new moves, or a kind of limit break system for using heavily damaging spells, is a very welcome step in making fighting more interesting for a longer period of time. As you break barriers and make your way deeper into the hidden chambers of the Sarafan Fortress, you find your prey, Moebius, speaking to someone unseen, clearly receiving new directions. And you confront him, asking about the current location of Raziel, to which he snarkily replies,
Perhaps you should ask, when?
He incapacitates Kane with his magic orb and taunts the vampire, implying heavily that despite all that has happened during the previous games, Kane is still unaware of the larger implications of everything happening around him. After this back and forth, Kane's narration ensures that the next time he is to meet Moebius, he has some tricks up his own sleeves as well. And so ends Chapter 1. Just like in Blood Omen 2, Defiance is cut into chapters. This alone is not a bad thing, and considering the focus on storytelling that the developers have clearly chosen for the franchise, this kind of segmentation works pretty well. The beginning of Chapter 2 is a good example of one of the major reasons why this is, as you begin the chapter as Raziel, now trapped within the underworld where the Elder God is chastising him. Clearly, Raziel's rebellious nature wasn't something the Elder God appreciated, and he's now keeping him imprisoned and famished until he renounces his free will and accepts his place as the servant of the Elder God. Here, the game also gives us some exposition, which is good, especially considering how newer players would be completely unfamiliar with the concepts, as the Elder God explains the nature of the Wheel of Fate, the eternal cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, and Raziel's place as the servant of said wheel. It also taunts Raziel, calling him cowardly for remaining a prisoner, as in the outside world the Soul Reaver is waiting to finally consume his soul, within which Raziel would spend the rest of eternity, trapped as the soul-devouring spirit within the sword, a fate so horrendous that the mental toll of it would be unimaginable. Still, this does awaken something within Raziel, as he decides that the only way for future to change is for something to be done about it. So he begins to placate the Elder God, pretending to surrender to its will. This leads to the second tutorial of the game. The first part of Raziel's tutorial is relatively simple and mostly demonstrates features that you already learned as you were playing as Kane. The movement and fighting mechanics of both characters are basically identical, so the first rooms are just a demonstration of this fact to the player. In the fighting portion, there is one minor change, however, since the feeding needs of the characters are slightly different. And as you fight enemies in the spirit realm, they do not exactly die, but instead, like in the earlier games, merely turn translucent and unable to attack you. While in this form they can be fed on, but if left to their own devices for long enough, they will attempt to feed on something and, in effect, resurrect themselves, requiring you to defeat them again. Sure, this is not exactly a major difference, but it is enough to add some variety to the combat strategies of each of the characters. After these rooms, you end up near the exit from this abyss, and the Elder God attempts to stop you from leaving. This is basically a room that tests how well you've learned the platforming mechanics of the game, including how the glide function is much more useful for terrain traversal with Raziel than it is with Kane. At the top of this cavern, the game tells you about the spectral realm mechanic of the game, telling you that you're trapped within this complex until you're able to find a conduit into the physical realm, as within the physical realm, you could just swim to the exit. A similar explanation of the mechanics happens as you encounter a door and are told that you can only manipulate physical objects within the physical realm. These are rather simple ways to introduce some of the realm mechanics to new players without feeling too out of character, as they are written as internal monologues of Raziel, who is trying to find a way out from this place. There is also a change that returning players may notice from the earlier games, as now Raziel can scale certain walls in the spectral realm. Previously, this was not possible since digging your claws into a wall was considered manipulating the physical realm, which was not possible. But that has been changed now to add more options for map exploration in both realms. As you find a conduit between the physical and spectral realms, the Elder God's disembodied voice confronts you, and we get more of an explanation to how these conduits work within the universe of Nosgoth. In previous games, the nature of the conduits wasn't properly explored, but instead they just felt like a game design choice with little in-world implications. In Defiance, however, they are revealed to be either created or at the very least controlled by the Elder God itself, as it disables these conduits, preventing you from entering the physical realm, as it gives Raziel one final taunt.
I have no need for you to enter the physical world, so no conduit will be granted. You serve me adequately as a wraith.
Soon, the true severity of this statement hits Raziel, and this merely strengthens his dedication to finding a way to leave this plane of existence behind. And so begins the next chapter, as we return to where we left Kane, in the caverns beneath the Sarafan fortress, surrounded by wraiths. This is basically how the game is structured, and it makes for some interesting storytelling, having the game include the stories of our two protagonists told in relatively small snippets back to back, alternating between the characters after each important story beat. I really like this, and it's one aspect of trying to be more like the movies that I actually think works in a game like this. It's not just trying to copy a look, but actually weaving the storytelling to the structure of the game in a creative way, which also means that technically after each chapter there's a sort of a cliffhanger that you'll have to wait a while to see get resolved. It also made me think about how will these two stories eventually connect to each other. After all, after Soul Reaver 2, Kane and Raziel were separated, and Raziel was drawn into the abyss, back into the lair of the Elder God, where he has been kept prisoner for we don't even know how long at this point. At the same time, we are seeing the story of Kane, who's looking for Raziel, whom he sees as a key to changing the destinies of them both, and bringing back balance to the world while saving the vampire species from extinction. In addition to that, Moebius clearly has some kinds of plans in motion again, which might thwart whatever plans Kane has. This kind of structuring really tends to work for me, and it managed to excite my interest in how all of these plot points would eventually be resolved. The rest of the chapter revolves around simple puzzle solving and the demonstration of a few features involving Kane's abilities. Block puzzles make a return, but even more simplified than before, and most of what could in theory be called puzzle solving is more about finding an item, which is then put into the artifacts category in your status menu, and finding a place to insert that item in. Another example of the simplification, which I'm not at all a fan of, is the pair of doors with symbols I mentioned before. In the first chapter, it seemed like an interesting clue to what you might have to deal with later, but now its purpose is explained to the player in detail, which completely removes the joy of discovery from figuring something out. In fact, the vast majority of this chapter is straightforward combat. Most of the rooms you enter as you travel through the Sarafan fortress are blocked off once you enter them, and several enemies appear around you, which you need to dispatch to be able to continue. Overall, Defiance has moved even more focus away from the puzzle-solving elements of the Soul Reaver games and concentrates more heavily on combat. Depending on the types of games you enjoy, this might be either a good thing or a bad thing. In the earlier games, I would have definitely written this off as a very bad thing, since the combat was never the most interesting part of the Legacy of Kain series. This time, however, the combat actually feels pretty good, and the combination of the basic attacks, quick dodges, special attacks, magic and telekinesis really do work together quite well, allowing for many creative ways of combining your offensive abilities to make each encounter feel like a violent dance of life and death. The third chapter also adds a new type of enemy into the mix, a spellcaster type which acts partially as a support character, giving a protective shield around another combatant. A small addition such as this is much more interesting than the spellcasters in Soul Reaver 2, for example, where they acted merely as an alternate skin for ranged attackers. Many of Kane's abilities also make a return, including the jump ability from Blood Omen 2. A major change to those abilities is how they are no longer completely under your control. While in Blood Omen, you could turn into the mist form whenever you wanted to, as long as you had enough magic energy to do so. This time, the mist form is a situational thing and is automatically used to pass certain obstacles and during dodging. This automatic nature also applies to most other abilities as well, and to things like the long jump and turning into the bat form to move into another area are now done in specific locations and always function in the exact same way. Considering the structure of the game, this change is understandable, but does feel like it's taking control away from the player, which is not the best decision in my opinion. At the end of the chapter, you once more confront Moebius. This time, with the odds in your favor, and our two old souls engage in more dialogue revolving around the nature and existence of Raziel. Moebius berates Kane for not understanding what he's doing and how his manipulations are pathetic, and will never save him from his eventual fate or change the fate of the vampire species, while revealing that Raziel indeed is dangerous to his plans, as Raziel still retains his free will, making his future uncertain and unseeable. A frightening proposition to someone whose entire life has been that of certainty due to their control over time. While proclaiming that Kane and Raziel will meet their appointed fates when the time is right, one of which involving a final fight between the two, when Raziel is destined to slay Kane. And until that point, Raziel will remain imprisoned. Moebius taunts Kane's ignorance and tells him to go west of the Pillars of Nosgoth to a place where the answers he seeks are written in stone, before teleporting away, as he tends to do. Kane, curious as he is, decides to follow up on this clue, but has little faith in Moebius' honesty.
Go west of the Pillars. There you will find a testament written in stone.
But stones too can lie.
As Kane departs the Sarafan fortress, we return to the story of Raziel, as he's pondering how to escape the spirit realm without the help of the conduits provided by the Elder God. If the first chapter with Raziel acted as a way to introduce his part of the story, the second chapter with him acts as an introduction to several gameplay elements you'll encounter while playing as him. The very first thing you may notice is the very visible relic container, but attempting to break it, as you've done several times by now as Kane, doesn't work, since you're in the spirit realm where interacting with the physical realm isn't possible. As you explore the graveyard, you may find a curious-looking door that's locked with two devices, and symbols which Raziel recognizes as the elemental symbols of light and darkness, things first introduced in Soul River 2. Deep in the graveyard, Raziel finds a location that is emanating a strong spiritual essence, and comes up with an idea. He strains his will and inserts his soul into the corpse from which the essence is emanating from, and emerges back in the physical realm. This is an interesting way to change the lore of how he can enter the physical realm and diminish the influence of the Elder God, while in gameplay terms keeping the mechanic exactly the same as it always was, except instead of finding white glowing conduits, you find buried corpses with a strong spiritual essence. Now in the physical realm, weaknesses from previous games also return, including how your health is constantly draining while inhabiting a physical form, requiring you to feed occasionally to not have to return to the spirit realm. There are some changes from the previous game when it comes to Raziel, however, including how the Spirit Reaver has once more changed in its functionality. In the first Soul Reaver, the Spirit Reaver was only available in the physical realm when at full health, but when you did have it, the blade was an extremely powerful weapon. In Soul Reaver 2, the nature of the blade changed, and you could call the weapon at will, but if you used the weapon it would consume the souls of the enemies defeated with it, making using it more feasible, but also removing your ability to heal while using it, which was a very interesting drawback to add to the combat system. In Defiance, the nature of the blade has changed and is in a way a combination of both the earlier incarnations of the weapon, as the blade spawns automatically as you attack an enemy, but it does not destroy the souls of the enemies you're fighting. Instead, feeding on souls acts in a similar way to feasting on blood as Kane. Unlike in previous games, you do not merely kill an enemy and then wait for their soul to detach from their body and feed on it. Instead, you have to feed on the enemies while they are stunned and rip the soul from their bodies. As if you let them die, the soul almost immediately disappears into the underworld. While as a mechanic this is somewhat different to the previous games, I don't consider this a massive retcon, and the change works well with a new faster combat system where the old way of feeding on souls would likely break the flow of the combat. trying out how this works in practice can be done on the abundant vampire hunters scouring the graveyards for more prey to kill. This to Raziel places the timeline to a point sometime after Kane's mortal death, and he decides to find his way to the Pillars of Nosgoth and speak with the spirit of the previous Balance Guardian, Ariel. To do so, however, he needs to unlock the doorway locked with the elemental powers, and a large portion of this chapter is focused on unlocking the required elements by finding the appropriate forges and completing the somewhat simple challenges within, which consist mostly of exploring the area to find objects you can activate with the recently unlocked elements, finding all of which unlocks the exit from the forge. While doing this, possessed corpses begin to hunt Raziel, clearly knowing who he is, while Raziel is unaware of who these spirits may be. That is irrelevant to him at this point, and they merely pose yet another obstacle in your way to finding out what is going on. One very positive returning feature is the usefulness of the realm shifting ability. In the Soul Reaver 2 review, I lamented the lack of points where that feature was actually used well. The developers have now clearly learned their lesson, and while not as interesting as in the original Soul Reaver, now there are again several locations where the spectral shifting can be used to proceed forwards with your quest. I do love this, since the way how the physical and spirit realms differed from each other and how these differences were implemented into puzzle solving and exploration was one of my favorite features of the first Soul Reaver, and the lack of that was very much a disappointment to me in Soul Reaver 2. So it makes me happy to see that the feature returns and is treated rather well. The elemental forges serve another very important purpose in the game, in addition to giving you new abilities to play with, as they also act as summarized history lessons of the world of Nosgoth, in the form of narration from Raziel as he explains the meaning of murals within the ancient vampire constructions. Most of the information revealed in this way is already known to players who have gone through the entire franchise up until this point, but it's absolutely necessary to have these portions to give newer players some kind of a frame of reference to what is happening and why you're even doing any of this. Especially since until now, the game has not been entirely good at explaining the motivations of the characters or the world in general, and has mostly relied on players already having some kind of an idea of what the overarching story of the series is. An interesting aspect about the elemental upgrades to the Reaver is required to make progress in this area. As mentioned earlier, once the Soul Reaver gauge in your user interface is full, you can unleash the magical energies within the blade. What this energy is and does depends on what element you currently have equipped. For example, having the dark element equipped as you unleash the spell will cause Raziel to become invisible, a feature which is not only useful to make combat somewhat easier, but also allows you to pass what amount to magical security cameras that block your passage if they see you. Swimming also makes a return in Defiance, and it's still not terribly good. Underwater, the camera locks behind Raziel in a similar way as in previous games, but that does not apply to when you are on the surface. This can be relatively disorienting, but at the very least the underwater effect is much less annoying than it was in Soul Reaver 2. So for the most part, you can actually see where you're going. Overall, it's an improvement, but not a massive one. Once you've unlocked the elements, Raziel unlocks the gate to the next area and the story switches back to Kane's point of view. Back in the past, Kane has reached the Pillars of Nosgoth, beyond which Moebius claims lie the answers to Kane's questions about whether or not destiny can truly be rewritten. For the most part, this area doesn't progress the story very much, but does give some exposition about Kane's motivations and the nature of the pillars themselves. Once more, clearly being exposition intended to familiarize new players to the game. You complete the area and dispel magics which hide an ancient stronghold, the nature of which is a mystery, but may hold secrets Kane is looking for. Before we get there, however, it's time to once more see how Raziel's journey is progressing. 500 years in the future, Raziel reaches the same location you just visited as Kane, but now as a different kind of creature. Passages which were closed to you as Kane are now open. Before you reach the next door, something strange happens. Some of the spirits that have been possessing the corpses and attacking you have apparently increased in strength, as one of them possesses a vampire hunter. While in gameplay terms that doesn't change too much, it's still concerning. If the spirits can now possess humans, what can they do if they gain even more strength? Within the next elemental forge, more murals can be found, this time depicting the forging of the Soul Reaver, the sword which the vampires intended to be wielded by their prophesied savior, Raziel. but is now destined to house his soul within it, being created by none other than the ancient vampire Vorador himself. Not only that, it is revealed that Vorador was not only the eldest child of the legendary vampire Janus Audrin, but the first human to be given the dark gift of vampirism, as a desperate bid of the now cursed and sterile vampires to retain their bloodline. With these revelations, Raziel is not only determined to find Ariel, but also Vorador, who in this time should still be very much alive. But to do that, you must first solve the elemental forge of fire. This continues the same pattern as in the previous Raziel chapter, with some additions. The challenges within the forge are longer and require even more exploration. And before you can even imbue the spectral blade with a new element, you must find 2 boss creatures and defeat them to activate the forge. These boss battles against the spirits of the ancient vampire pillar guardians are not that complex or difficult, but they still act as a nice change of pace. Having gained the elemental power of fire, Raziel is finally able to reach the pillars of Nosgoth, which in this time are all corrupted, signifying that Kane is yet to return any of the guardian talismans to the pillars. Here you meet the spirit of Ariel, who does not recognize Raziel and instead seems to mistake him for someone else.
My kind, what exactly do you think I am?
Your name shall remain unspoken, as decreed by our ancestors.
This little line to me is fantastic. In Blood Omen, the name Unspoken was mentioned once in a throwaway sentence, but now this name gets more significance. Clearly Ariel knows of this Unspoken and its nature, since she taunts Raziel, saying that his kind will finally come to an end once Kane has completed his mission and restored the pillars. Raziel, not particularly interested in Ariel's beliefs of what will happen, since he knows what the future entails, merely wishes to know how to find Vorador in this time, hoping to reach him before Moebius' vampire hunter mob is able to reach him and publicly execute him. To reach Vorador's swamp manor, however, requires the unlocking of yet another element for the spirit reaver, which takes place in another elemental forge that functions basically exactly the same as the previous one, with one exception. The final part of the Air Forge combines all of the elemental affinities in its final puzzles, which would be more interesting if the puzzles didn't consist of choose the right element and press action. In the Air Forge, another mural can be seen, one depicting a portion of an ancient vampire prophecy. In this mural, a vision of the vampire hero, assumed to be Raziel, is shown fighting a foe wielding a flaming sword. Unfortunately, the details of this mural have faded, leaving the identity of this foe unclear. As Raziel departs towards Vorador's lair, we jump back to Kane, who's reached his destination, now revealed to be an ancient vampire citadel that has been long abandoned, from where Kane hopes to find answers to his questions, which, unlike what Moebius seemed to believe, do not revolve around the nature and future of Raziel, but those of his own as the guardian of balance. Within the citadel, more murals can be found, one of which depicts a part of history after the vampires were inflicted with the curse of vampirism. For a time, the vampires seemed to adopt and even kidnap humans who were intended to become the new guardians, but eventually the humans rebelled, launching a campaign which overthrew the vampiric rule and installed humans as the dominant species of Nosgoth. This rebellion was led by none other than Moebius the Time Streamer and Mortanius the Necromancer, 2 guardians whose lives intertwine with the existence of Kane. More murals describe the battle between the vampire champion and his foe in more detail, in a prophetic painting where the vampire champion is defeated by his foe, clearly Hilden in appearance. Still, most of the areas of the citadel are closed off to Kane, including a very prominent door at the center of the citadel, locked with a seal that requires the completed power-up emblem, so he needs to find more pieces of the emblem to proceed further. This is one of the worst portions of the game in my opinion, partially because the story moves on very slowly, but also because the vast majority of this chapter is just repetition of the areas you've already explored as Raziel, with the exception that now the forges you explore have no puzzles to solve, but instead are just a gauntlet of combat arena rooms. In the end, you collect a new emblem, battle your way through more and more enemies, one of which is a pretty cool reference to the main menu of Soul Reaver, and open a pathway deeper into the Vampire Citadel. And once more, the scene changes to Raziel, who's reached the manor of Vorador, hoping to find the old vampire still alive. The manor stands tall within the Thermagant forest, protected by not only its imposing architecture, but by magical means as well. Here, Vorador has hidden himself somewhere, and Raziel is determined to find him. To this end, you must solve more puzzles, fight through hordes of enemies also looking for Vorador, and unlock another aspect of the elemental reaver. Eventually, your efforts begin to bear fruit, and more story is revealed. In the Elemental Forge, Raziel finds another mural, this one as well depicting the battle between the vampire and Hilden champions, but now in pristine clarity. This, to Raziel, is not a relief, but a source of distress. He doesn't view his current form worthy of being depicted as one of the ancient vampires whom he in Soul Reaver 2 described as beautiful and angelic. Instead, he sees more similarities with himself and the more grotesque appearance of the Hilden champion. Still believing that the prophecies of the vampires lead to the final confrontation between him and Kane, but now wondering whether Kane was always intended to be the vampire champion, while he is the champion of their adversaries. This is a very interesting part of the story for me, especially since during the previous chapter it was possible to visit this exact mural, but the camera wouldn't focus on it, nor would Kane comment on it. And why would he? He already saw a later part of the prophecy depicted in a mural outside the vampire citadel, so for him this mural was meaningless. Whereas for Raziel, this is the first time seeing the vampire champion's foe as depicted by the ancient vampires, showing how differently Kane and Raziel find information during their travels, even though many of their steps take them to the same places, even if separated by several centuries. Not only that, the narration of the two protagonists shows quite well how different their interpretations of the information are. Kane is staunch in his belief that Raziel is the vampire champion and is prophesied to fall at the hands of the Hilden, seeking for a way to prevent this from happening. Whereas Raziel believes it is him and Kane who are meant to fight each other, perhaps even beginning to think that it's he who needs to be defeated, or the enemies of the vampires will win. Eventually you find Vorador himself, who unfortunately doesn't have much information to share with you. He may have forged the physical blade, but any magics in the blade or prophecies surrounding it were kept mostly a secret from him, and only the ancient vampires know the full extent of these secrets. However, there may still be a chance, as he has protected the body of Nosgoth, the last surviving member of the ancient vampires, whose heart the human Raziel once tore from his chest 5 centuries ago. Vorador says that the heart was taken into the Avernus Cathedral and hidden within, hoping that Raziel would be able to infiltrate the place, avoid the ancient dangers within, and recover the heart which is still beating and sustaining Janos' body. Returning the heart would resurrect the ancient vampire and give Raziel the opportunity to find the answers he seeks. And perhaps finally, all of the machinations and manipulations would begin to come together and make sense to him. Thankfully, he's not forgotten anything important regarding this issue, and he leaves towards the cathedral with a clear mission in mind.
Janos must stay dead.
Back in Kane's story, you find another portal to the Elemental Forges, where more enemies and a puzzle defend the final piece of the balance emblem, which you've been using to enhance the Soul Reaver's abilities. Not only that, you find 2 murals in a room that was inaccessible to Raziel. Here, 2 prophecies were made of the same event, one mural depicting the victory of the vampire champion over the Hilden champion, and the other one, similar to one seen before, showing the exact opposite. As you use the completed emblem to open the sealed chamber back at the vampire citadel, you find a curiously small room with a small pool in the middle of it. Nothing seems to be here until suddenly, a voice addresses Kane. The voice calls itself the Oracle of Kane's ancestors, and explains it already knows what Kane wants, displaying in the scrying pool images of Raziel at the Avernus Cathedral, seeking the Heart of Darkness to resurrect Nosgoth. The Oracle says to Kane that they both know that great harm will come if Raziel succeeds in this task. Therefore, he must be stopped. Despite not trusting the Oracle, Kane decides that he has no choice but to follow its instructions for now, as the Oracle has created a portal through time, which would transport Kane to the very hour in which Raziel enters the cathedral. And so, Kane jumps through the portal and finds himself hundreds of years in the future. Within the cathedral, Raziel has located another elemental forge with a mural that to him explains much about the history of the ancient vampires. Depicted in this mural is the Wheel of Fate. showing the vampire's fall from its embrace. To Raziel, this clarifies the true nature of the vampire curse. It is not the bloodlust, but the immortality, which caused the Elder God to turn its back on the vampires, driving many of them to despair. While for the ancient vampires, this was a curse, Raziel's more intimate knowledge of the nature of this creature gives him a unique perspective.
But I had seen him, and whatever he was no god.
Scouring through the area, you eventually locate a hidden passage into the depths beneath Avernus, where the true nature of the Cathedral becomes clear. Within these caverns lie more murals describing the battle between the vampires and the Hilden, but this time from the other perspective. According to the Hilden murals, the vampires unquestionably followed the Wheel of Fate and demanded the Hilden to do so as well, which they rejected. This rejection caused the vampires to start a war which was to spell the doom of both species. To Raziel, it now seems more clear than ever that he might not be the vampire champion after all, but that of the Hilden. Even further, you stumble upon a ritual, as the cultists within these ancient Hilden chambers are in the process of sacrificing a human to something they call the Hashak Geek. Out of sheer curiosity, Raziel peers into the ritual pit, but suddenly a force pulls him down. At the bottom dwells a monstrous creature, hungry for blood, believing itself to be a god, and to Raziel's surprise, this creature recognizes him, which results in a shocking discovery. This creature is Turell, the one vampire brother not fought during the events of Soul Reaver, and it is revealed he was summoned into this place and has been imprisoned in the pit for untold amounts of time, clearly becoming mentally unstable as a result. Soon, the Hilden spirits possess him, demonstrating the reason for his imprisonment, as he acts as a durable vessel for this possession, and in this state, has acted as the god for the human cultists, with the Hilden using Turell's body to steer humanity into a direction which would eventually result in their release from their eternal imprisonment. Now they implore Raziel to continue his quest and kill Kane, before Turell is released from their control, and in his bloodlust decides to attack Raziel, hoping to gain his powers and finally be able to escape this torturous bondage. This segment to me is fascinating, not only because of how the storyline moves forwards and links many previously unresolved story threads together, such as the hidden cultist caverns beneath Avernus Cathedral in Blood Omen, which served little purpose other than to reveal that there was a cult and thus the nature of the cathedral itself was put into question. But what was this cult's purpose? We never truly knew, until now. This edition of Turell as the Hashak Geek does a good job of tying up a loose end created by cutting his content from Soul Reaver, and is written pretty well into the storyline. Another interesting part about this segment is the resulting boss battle against him, which brings into mind the boss encounters of Soul Reaver, since once more you can't directly attack Turell, but need to take advantage of the environment to first render him vulnerable. The only real problem with this boss fight is that it reminds the player that the earlier boss fights could have been interesting as well, instead of merely extensions of the regular fight mechanics. Once you defeat Turell, Raziel continues his habit from Soul Reaver and consumes his soul, this time unlocking an enhanced version of his telekinetic abilities. It's nice that this aspect of the franchise was not completely forgotten and actually got some more use. Up until this point, the telekinetic abilities of Raziel and Kane were different. While Kane could more effectively use his abilities to throw around enemies and break down objects, Raziel was only capable of projecting a telekinetic blast, just as in Soul Reaver. But now, his abilities match those of Kane. In gameplay terms, this could feel like an artificial limitation for Raziel, but the way it's linked to the lore is great. Since Raziel gained his telekinetic abilities in the first place by absorbing the soul of an older minion of Turell, it makes sense that the fully evolved ability would be unlocked only after consuming the soul of the progenitor of that lineage. Climbing out of the pit takes us to another meeting which wraps up multiple loose ends of the story, as you meet Mortanius the Necromancer, who's currently in the process of calling the younger Kane to the Pillars for their final confrontation. Mortanius as well seems to believe Raziel is the champion of the Hilden and taunts him about how he's too late, and how his plan is nearing completion, proclaiming his faith in how Kane will restore balance to the Pillars, finally locking away the Hilden for good. Soon, the Necromancer is possessed by a Hilden spirit, whom Raziel identifies as being the Unspoken, of which many have now, ironically, spoken about to him. as the Hilden taunts Raziel, pleased with the success of their plans to infiltrate the Guardians of the Pillars and use the Guardians themselves to finally set the Hilden free, before releasing control back to Mortanius. After being released, Mortanius also explains that while it was him and Moebius who originally led the rebellion against the vampires, he now understands that was a mistake, and they didn't know what the Pillars were truly holding back. But now he has set events in motion with the hopes that that mistake could be undone, and Kane is an important part of that equation. Raziel realizes that the Heart of Darkness was used to bring back Kane from his death, transforming him into the vampire he is now, and demands to know where it is hidden, before another wave of understanding seems to strike him.
You cannot make use of it as long as Kane guards it with his life.
Kane has it. It is in Kane.
Check and mate.
Then Mortanius leaves to meet his destiny, still holding on to his belief that Kane will restore balance to the Pillars, and so Raziel leaves as well. Immediately after reaching the main chamber of the Cathedral, he is confronted by Kane. Feeling distraught and angry, Raziel and Kane joust verbally for a while, with Kane attempting to persuade Raziel to give up this task of finding the Heart of Darkness, as Janos must stay dead. To Raziel's astonishment, Kane is unaware of where the Heart of Darkness has been hidden, preferring to not know anything about it as he believes the heart needs to stay hidden. Unwilling to be told what to do, Raziel lashes out and a battle ensues. As a set piece, this portion of the game is very interesting, but from a gameplay perspective, it's mediocre. Especially after the more interesting boss battle with Turell that had taken place mere minutes before, since now you're playing as Kane, battling against Raziel, both of you using the movesets available during the game. After depleting the health bar of Raziel, another cutscene plays where it seems that some form of manipulation is being done by the Hilden, as his eyes glow in a similar way as has been seen whenever a Hilden spirit possesses a body. Now the battle changes, as instead of Kane, you now play as Raziel. This also highlights the immense similarities with how both of the characters work, as the actual functionality of the battle remains almost identical, even though the sides have now switched. This is why I say it's an interesting portion as a set piece, but also acts as a way to show some of the limitations of the game. Thankfully, it does not take long to defeat Kane, and another cutscene plays. Now, Raziel is more than willing, in his burst of anger, to kill Kane, and he strikes. But as Kane stops him by grabbing his arm, the spirit of Raziel uses Kane's body as a conduit, beginning to drain into the Soul Reaver. This merely reinforces Raziel's rage. Was this Kane's plan all along, to finally trap him in the Sword for all eternity? No. He will not accept this fate, and thrust his free hand into the chest of Kane, ripping the Heart of Darkness out of his body. While Kane is still shocked about this turn of events, Raziel telekinetically pushes him away and his body disappears into a portal. With the battle over, the rage within Raziel subsides, and he realizes that both of them stepped right into the trap set by their enemies, and he can't be sure whether Kane truly intended to kill him or not, and apparently, now he would never know. You travel back through Vorador's mansion, where Moebius and his mob have already captured the vampire and are taking him towards his execution, as he taunts Raziel, saying that while Kane and Raziel were pondering their roles in the ancient prophecies, to him and his master it was all irrelevant, as the only thing that mattered was their confrontation and its inevitable end result. After large amounts of fighting, Raziel reaches the chamber of Janos and uses the Heart of Darkness to resurrect him. Unsure about what all this portends, Janos transports them both to the vampire citadel, promising that here Raziel would finally find the answers he seeks. Deep within the innermost chambers lies an ancient spirit forge, connected to all but one of the elemental aspects of the Reaver, and for some reason, the Elder God is attempting to stop the stream of energy within this forge from being released. This results in what could be called a boss fight, but it's more of a platforming challenge which requires some amount of precision jumping and quick switching of the elemental affinity of the Reaver. Completing this task, the forge is fully powered up and its nature revealed, as a healed version of Ariel's spirit appears to talk to Raziel, explaining that by attuning all of the elements, the previous balance guardians were called into this place. Bringing the Soul Reaver here has one purpose: to completely purify the Soul Reaver and attune it to balance itself, by absorbing the power of every balanced guardian that has ever existed. a fitting weapon for the sign of balance, revealed to be Kane, the prophesied savior of Nosgoth. This despairs Raziel, as after all he had just torn the life-sustaining heart from Kane's chest and seen his body disappear into nothingness. So he returns to Janos, hoping to find a way forwards, but alas, this is the fateful moment in history when the younger Kane defeated the Vessel of the Unspoken and refused to sacrifice himself. As he does so, the pillars shatter, and the weakened barrier between Nosgoth and the dimension to which the Hilden were banished is finally broken, and so the Unspoken possesses Janos' body, taunting Raziel about how he played right into their hands, delivering to them a powerful immortal vessel which the Hilden intend to use as they conquer the entirety of Nosgoth. This leads to a boss fight which is actually somewhat good, especially when compared to the earlier battles in the game, and you have to properly read the tells of the possessed Janos to be able to defeat him. Eventually, Raziel prevails, and Janos briefly regains control of his body, begging Raziel to end him so he can't be used by their ancient enemies. Unfortunately, this causes Raziel to falter for a moment, which allows the Unspoken to possess Janos again and rip Raziel in half. The Hilden plan has now been successful, and the Unspoken knows this, as Raziel fades back into the spirit realm, being pulled into the Spirit-Forged chamber, where the Elder God intends to imprison him for all eternity. Had the game ended here, it would have been a pretty annoying cliffhanger to have for what ended up being the final part of the franchise, at least so far. Thankfully, the story still continues, as next you play as Kane, who, surprised to be alive, finds himself in the hellish dimension where the Hilden were banished. Fighting his way out and following the traces of Raziel, Kane eventually finds himself in the chamber of the Spirit Forge, where the time streamer Moebius is talking to the Elder God, ironically about the death of Kane, whose appearance surprises them both. This realization has immense implications to Kane, and likely also for the player, even if they are not directly vocalized within the game itself. We were told that Raziel's unusual rebirth in death is the reason why he was completely detached from the Wheel of Fate, giving him true free will, and making him practically invisible within the time streams. A wild card whose actions are impossible to predict for certain. Kane has now experienced a similar moment himself, as his heart was torn out, and at that very moment of death, he was cast into the dimension where life and death are meaningless. So he died, but survived. How he seems to be invisible to Moebius' prescient abilities, perhaps he too has gained true free will. With this realization, Kane decides Moebius has nothing he needs anymore and impales him. In the spirit realm, Moebius' spirit rises from his body and begins to prostrate himself in front of his god, not noticing Raziel's presence, who summarily also impales his spirit with a reaver. This action causes Moebius to see the squid-like Elder God's true form for the first time, equally horrified by this visage as he is by the soul reaver sticking out from his chest. With this knowledge, Raziel sends Moebius to his master and has a realization. He was never the vampire savior, and his destiny is now clear. If the purified reaver was intended for Kane as the only weapon capable of defeating the true adversary, this parasitic creature feasting on the lives of every soul in Nosgoth, and the only way to truly even know this creature exists is to possess the purifying flame of the Spirit Reaver. He knows there is only one thing to do, and so he possesses Moebius' corpse, which Kane believes was resurrected by the Elder God, and impales it once more. The realization that it is instead Raziel horrifies him, and he attempts to pull the Reaver out, but Raziel stops him, giving one of the most emotional speeches of the entire franchise, as he has finally shed all hatred he harbored for Kane, and willingly sacrifices himself for this cause, so Kane can finally make a true difference in this world.
This is what I am for. The two become one, both soul reavers together, and the sign of balance is healed. And I am not your enemy, not your destroyer. I am, as before, your right hand, your sword.
As Raziel's spirit begins to inhabit the Soul Reaver, Kane begins to see things previously unseen, and the Elder God's visage becomes visible to him. The Elder God itself begins to immediately taunt Kane, threatening him with eternal imprisonment, which merely strengthens Kane's resolve. The battle with the Elder God is the final confrontation of the game, and takes the form of one of the more interesting boss battles. In a way, it's similar to the fight with Janos, in how you need to read for tells, dodge projectiles and melee attacks, and strike when you've reached certain set conditions to lower the shield on the Elder God's eye. Winning this battle leads to the final cutscenes, where the Elder God, despite being injured, very confidently states that eventually he will have Kane's soul, whether he wants it or not, as he is eternal. But Kane has his own taunts.
Your wretched, stagnant soul will finally be mine.
In the meantime, you'd best burrow deep.
Now with the Hilden freed from their imprisonment and the Elder God revealed to Kane, things could seem dire. But with his newfound free will and Raziel's sacrifice, which has given Kane the means to not only know that a true enemy exists, but to also harm this enemy, there is finally something that Kane has not truly had for all this time.
More acute even than the vision his sacrifice had accorded me. The first bitter taste of that terrible illusion. Hope.
I have very mixed feelings about Defiance. On one hand, it does a lot of things right and improves upon many aspects of the previous games. But on the other hand, when it fails pretty hard. As tends to be the case with the series, the story is once more the best part of the game. In the earlier games, the stories have added little threads which seemed to go nowhere, and a bunch of those threads finally get a resolution in Defiance. Whether it's the identity of the unspoken, or finally understanding the true nature of Moebius' faith, or the complete vampire prophecy and our main character's places within that prophecy, to less important seeming loose threads like the cult of Hashak Gik beneath Avernus Cathedral, which was previously only mentioned in Blood Omen. So many of the story beats in this game link to the earlier games, adding important context and finally giving the player closure. It is also nice how there are parts that may not seem like they were telegraphed in some way or another, but in fact they were, such as the Spirit Forge where Raziel purifies the Reaver by absorbing the spirits of the Balance Guardians into the blade, which was shown in Soul Reaver as a vision towards the end. During that game though, we merely got a misinterpretation of the event. I love this so much, and as you may have noticed even from the size of this video, there's a lot of story in this game, and very little of it is uninteresting to me. There's one part that I'm not sure about, however, and that's the place of Vorador and Janos within the timeline. Since in the Blood Omen 2 timeline it was established that Vorador was still alive and Janos was used to assist the Hilden in physically entering Nosgoth, something which seemed difficult even in this game, where they had to possess other creatures or corpses to be able to manifest in Nosgoth even after the collapse of the pillars. But if Vorador was once more executed by the vampire hunter mob, how could he still be alive then? Sure, you could completely dismiss the storyline of Blood Omen 2, but even that doesn't completely work, since it plays an important part in Kane's knowledge of the Hilden threat, and of Janos' place within the machinations of the Hilden. Overall though, it's not a massive issue to me, and considering the amount of story and how convoluted it is in many aspects, it's almost a miracle that there aren't even more obvious issues within the timelines. A curious aspect, which I hadn't paid much attention to, but was brought to my attention, might actually explain some of the deficiencies in the storytelling of Blood Omen 2. There was barely any narration in the game, which is a massive shame since the narration is one of the key features of storytelling aspect of the franchise. This time it's thankfully back, and acts as an amazing way to understand the inner thoughts and turmoils that the main characters are going through, while also giving us more exposition about the world. Perhaps this lack of narration is why some parts of Blood Omen 2 felt weird, and why the Vampire Lieutenant storyline, for example, was extremely lacking. As in other games of the franchise, those gaps in knowledge would have been filled with the narration. So it's possible there had originally been intent to have narration, but for some reason it was never actually made. As for Defiance, I really enjoy the storytelling structure, as it jumps between the two main characters, constantly giving us merely a glimpse of the story for each character, while often leading both of the characters to slowly come to different conclusions about the same subject because they are given different information. For me, this really worked, and the game was able to keep me very interested in seeing how all of this would finally conclude. Which brings us to the conclusion. That to me is a pretty great point to end the franchise. Yes, there are unresolved threads, quite major threads in fact, as now the Hilden who will become the Seraphim Lord has been released into the world, and Kane is finally aware of the existence and influence of the Elder God, whose machinations bind all souls to a never-ending cycle of life and death with no free will. These are admittedly pretty large threads to leave unresolved and could have been used to write another sequel, but it's also a great ending, because the relationship of Kane and Raziel was finally resolved, and Raziel's sacrifice as he accepted his fate as the spirit within the Soul Reaver was an amazing resolution to that storyline. That sacrifice and the events which led Raziel to make that decision willingly also led Kane to most likely have true free will within the universe. So, even if we didn't get an ending that represents an ultimate victory over the foes of Kane, nor did we see the healing of the land, the final words of the series still make it a fantastic ending for me, since finally it was shown that the efforts of Kane and Raziel were not in vain, and things can be changed. That alone is a victory of such scale that overshadows every other victory seen in the franchise. The fighting system of the game is pretty good. It's much faster than before, and you can easily swap targets even mid-combo, leading to a fluidity of combat which hasn't been seen in the series until this game. The addition of combo moves and elemental weapons and spells are also great additions, and you can really have a kind of dance with your enemies, and feel a sense of satisfaction as you perform combos in a way you planned to, seeing the carnage unfold in front of your eyes. However, it's not all roses, since while the fighting is pretty damn good, there's way too much of it. Especially in the first half of the game, you're constantly locked into combat arena rooms in almost every place you enter, and even with a fighting system that's immensely better than in any of the earlier games, it does start to feel more like a chore the longer the game goes. It doesn't help that most enemies in the game can easily be dispatched by repeating similar combos over and over again, or that the difficulty of the enemies is mostly created by just adding more health to them, leading to prolonged uninteresting fights being very common towards the end. And that is a shame. The combat arena should have been used more sparingly, and it would have been more interesting to me. That change would mean I could praise the combat system more, because the system itself is actually good. It's the implementation that is lacking. Sometimes it's not the foes that are your worst enemy in these encounters, but instead, it's the camera. The static camera they chose to use this time is not the best. There are many situations where you can barely see anything because the camera positioning is just not good. And it's sometimes easy to get disoriented and not be certain which direction you're even meant to go, or which direction you can go. Considering the extremely cramped nature of some encounters and how horribly the camera adjusts to some of these situations, I wouldn't be surprised if the game originally had the third-person camera system of the previous games, but was changed during development for some reason. And not all of the already finished maps were adjusted to properly take this new camera system into account. Or maybe this is cope, because I don't want to believe someone would make the camera so bad on purpose. The platforming and puzzle-solving aspects of the game are decent, and most of my criticisms about both of those revolve around the camera, which sometimes makes it difficult to see where you are in relation to the map geometry. And the immense amount of backtracking, which is often made even longer by having those locked-out combat arenas slow your progress even more. I did like how, in a few places, the realm shifting ability was actually used in an imaginative way, even if I'm very much not a fan of the effect used within the spectral realm. That kind of distortion effect now used in the realm to me was just disorienting, and that made being in the realm rather unpleasant to me. The audiovisual presentation of the game is mostly pretty good, despite some flaws. One glaring issue I had with the game was that the vast majority of the music seemed to be recycled from earlier games. Sure, this isn't the worst thing, since the music of the franchise has been good, but it would have been nice to hear more new themes. I also thought about adding yet another aspect ratio rant here, but I'll try to keep it short, since I've already gone into more detail about the topic in the Blood Omen 2 video. A great example of some complaints in that video are shown in the introduction of this game, as the introduction shows some portions of Soul Reaver's intro, but this time cropped to match a widescreen aspect ratio. Speaking of widescreen, funnily enough, Defiance does support widescreen resolutions on the PC, but there seems to be no coding in the game to actually take that into account. meaning that regardless of the aspect ratio of the resolution you choose, the game is still rendered in a 4:3 aspect ratio and merely stretched to the resolution you choose. There are fan patches to fix this, but since I try to play these as vanilla as possible, I didn't use them for making of this video. Overall, the game is mostly carried by the story, and while the combat initially feels fun, the lack of variety and challenge leads it to wear out its welcome rather quickly. The repetition of areas and backtracking for the sole purpose of padding the playtime while barely anything new can be found from those areas when revisiting them can make actually playing the game feel tedious at times. The game also doesn't make a terribly good job at actually introducing the world and the story to new players, which means that many portions of the game that to me were very meaningful and amazing to see might mean almost nothing to players who haven't played the earlier games. This really is the biggest weakness of the entire franchise, as it can be hard to hop into a game and properly try and understand what's going on without the context of the earlier games. For those who've played through all of the games, this aspect is obviously fantastic, but having that new player perspective in mind can explain why the series was in a way doomed to end at some point. Still, despite the flaws and some more annoying aspects of the game, I did actually enjoy it for the most part. And to me, it's a nice conclusion to the saga, even if the story ends at a point where there still could have been more to come. And I do think that this game is still worth experiencing, especially if you're the type of person who has the patience and interest to go through the entire franchise. As a standalone game, however, it's fine. That concludes a franchise that's had a place in my heart for a long time, and I'm glad to have replayed the entirety of it. As much as nostalgia is a powerful force, it's good to sometimes challenge that nostalgia and go through things you loved to see whether those things still hold up. And especially the story of this franchise, in my opinion, really does. Yes, many of the gameplay elements of every game shows its age and has to be taken in the context of the time, but they're also not so outdated that someone with even a passing interest in retro games couldn't get used to them. But that is it for this time, and I would like to thank all of the Ko-fi and Patreon supporters: High Food Court, Iliad Drone, Paul Leone, The Bloke, Zai, Cordell Hebert, and Daniel Zupka. Thank you for supporting this fantastic journey, as we've now reached the end of another series. Considering how long some of the franchises I'm interested in looking at are, in the future I might not always go through an entire series back to back, but might instead break the longer franchises up by doing some other games here and there between the franchise games. After all, I'd like to avoid getting a burnout, so having some variety will likely help avoiding that. I'm not anywhere near that point, mind you, but I'm still thinking about how I want to do the series reviews or retrospectives, whatever word you may wish to use. Next one though, I'll go through back to back, since it's a relatively short series, ties back to some things we've already done on this channel, and the latest iteration just got an update which I want to explore as we get to the final chapter of that upcoming saga. I think the best way to quickly explain the next topic would be this: Ultima Underworld in space. Until next time, Fitchvert signing out.